cancer. Our products are Leaping Bunny certified, vegan, and Monate can be used by anyone, including your kids and pets. Message me on my Instagram to partner with me. Founder shares are available, and as a market partner, you have access to uncapped bonuses, 45% commission, 35 to 55% off discounts, on top of all-inclusive paid trips. Right now, I also have a free gift for anyone that partners with me, so don't miss out. You can message me on my Instagram at LizChilvers87.
We still do 7 NUFC Matters show a week for free. But if you want to help support NUFC Matters, then there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast and video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications bell so you don't miss a single show. If you want to help us financially, then you can join the channel using this button with the membership starting at $1.99 a month. Or you can drop us a donation in the chat using a super sticker. We're also looking for sponsors. If you'd like your brand advertised on the flyers for the show and featured during the ad break, then email John at nufcmatters.com to arrange today. Good evening and welcome along to NUFC Matters with me, Steve Rafe, and Ben Jacobs for the transfer show. We're here till 6 o'clock. Good evening, Ben.
Hey, how you doing, Steve? Good evening to you. Good morning for me, because I'm in Santa Clara at the moment, where it's a breezy 30 degrees.
Very nice, mate. Very nice. Caught you on your travels. Thanks, as always, for jumping on and sparing us some time. Tom Dixon says, question for Ben. Is there anything on Galatasaray considering a move for Newcastle's Kieran Trippier? The Northern Echo went live with a story this morning to say that decisions have been made behind the scenes. There's no plans to offer Kieran Trippier a new contract. He's in the last year of a contract, which means that the exit door is now open for Kieran Trippier. So things looking as if they're going to heat up on that front, Ben.
Yeah, I do think it's possible that Kieran Trippier could go. I'm not sure that Galatasaray is his destination of choice. We know, of course, in January that Bayern was a possibility. And from Trippier's point of view, he would re-welcome that kind of approach. But if Trippier is to leave, it won't be the only option because of the price and due to, as you outlined, the situation that Newcastle are in there. Contractually, if they do offload, we're not talking about 25, 35, 40 million. It's likely to be under 20 million. And there might even be the opportunity for a suitor to have a kind of loan with option or an obligation. So this key juncture now for Trippier, because he's come back, he's resting, he's not really thought about any move away. He was one of those players, to my knowledge anyway, that wasn't prepared to deal with his future or any offers during or in the build-up to the Euros. And now we're at a situation where things could move. I'm not aware of anything advanced between Galatasaray and Trippier, nor am I told that necessarily Turkey would be his choice of destination. But there is a distinct possibility that Newcastle might sanction a Trippier exit. One of the reasons is because Tino Livramento is very highly rated and can, of course, play at right back. And the other thing they may do is bring on board a centre-back, right-back combination, which is where the links from Trevor Chalobah have materialised from. And that's quite interesting because, you know, when you look at Newcastle centre-backs, you've got Botman and Lascelles, who are both injured and out until the end of the year. So they have to bring in a centre-back. And I think their slight preference would be a right, not left-sided centre-back, because everyone knows when Botman's fit, then he's going to come into the side. So if you have another centre-back, you've got to be able to give them those guarantees. We know that Tosin was one example that they tried for. Lloyd Kelly has obviously already joined the football club as well. But one more is still what Newcastle are looking for. And it might be with Trippier in mind, whereby even if he was to stay, they still think that that centre-back, right-back versatility is very beneficial for the depth of the football club, and is even more useful was Trippier to depart.
Yeah, lots of questions coming in. Keep them coming in. We've only got till 6 o'clock tonight, guys, so please get your questions in. Keith, good evening. He said, with Callum Wilson already injured, do you now see a striker as a priority signing, even over a right winger and a centre-back?
Yeah, I think centre-back is urgent simply because of what I outlined before, that they've got a few injuries out until the end of the year. So you start to worry a little bit about your depth there, even though there are options currently within the squad. Then I think the right-sided player and potentially even another midfielder are going to be relatively high priority as far as Newcastle are concerned. Now, that's not me saying at this stage that Man City are definitively going to come in for Bruno Guimaraes. We know Newcastle's position and they want to keep the player. But of course, Elliot Anderson has departed, and therefore there could be room for one more there. Striker-wise, there has to be a succession plan for Callum Wilson, and good clubs don't wait for the player to go. They sign, and then maybe they have a one-year gap. So I don't think Newcastle would be devastated if Wilson stayed, despite the fact that there's been interest in him from West Ham United and from Saudi Arabia as well. But maybe minutes diminished, the fact that he gets injured, unfortunately, someone else young comes in. But if there's the option for some of the season to have Wilson plus a new younger striker and still Alexander Isak, then that's a bonus. But where striker maybe they're not as worried about is, one, Wilson hasn't gone yet. I know, as you say, there's an injury that's been picked up, but he's still at the football club. And then there's still the ability to use Anthony Gordon in a position that he really relishes, which is more central as well. And if you shift him, then Joe Linton can play in the front line. You've got Harvey Barnes at the moment. Miguel Almiron is still there as well. So there are plenty of options, but I think that somebody has to eventually replace Callum Wilson, whether it's this summer, whether it's January, or whether it's summer 2025. So if the right target presents itself now, then you move to make sure that you don't miss out on that opportunity. But I think from Newcastle's point of view, the big thing that they're looking for positional wise is still that centre-back. And we know about the links with Malik Thiaw, for example, and they've looked as well at a very ambitious one at Jean-Claire Todibo too. And then the right side is going to be very important, because I think, one, there's a chance Miguel Almiron goes, and two, if he stays, I still think at this point they feel that they can replace Miguel Almiron. And when maybe we spoke before that incredible season that he had, especially the first half, when Newcastle qualified for the Champions League, we were discussing, weren't we, in pre-season, Steve, how Almiron could go. Almiron was liked as an individual, but not necessarily fans' favourites. And then he had an absolutely outstanding pre-season, and suddenly everybody forgot about that front right side. But the finding someone more consistent as a goal scorer than Miguel Almiron has actually been there, not just in the last 12 months, but in the last 2 seasons. It's just the fact that he changed everybody's mind when he had that fantastic first half of the season, as did much of the Newcastle squad, obviously, because they were flying at that stage. But finding that right-sided player is still, I think, of a higher priority than finding a central striker, at least as long as Wilson remains at the club. And again, it doesn't make much difference, does it, really? Because if you're not looking for necessarily a winger that's going to assist more than they score, so much as either a 50-50 player or a wide forward, then you would expect some of the goals to come from that wide right player to compensate for the fact that maybe Callum Wilson will either be injured or have diminished game time.
Yeah, okay, lots of questions coming in. We'll try and get through as many of them as we can. Tom, good evening. Question for Ben. What's the latest on Malik Thiaw and Fikayo Tomori, as Newcastle are linked with them both?
Yeah, I think with the Tomori situation, I'm told that West Ham are more the ones to watch there at this stage. I think with Thiaw, we know that it's been a big target as far as Newcastle are concerned. And it's now at the stage where Newcastle are likely, in the coming days, if not hours, to make their opening formal offer. And the Milan sources that I speak to have said for quite some time that they've been braced for an offer. And we know that these links have been there for something in the region of 6 or 7 weeks, but Newcastle have been biding their time. Perhaps some of that was to do with the PSR deadline as well. And Milan's perspective is they're not desperate to sell, but at the right offer, they would be prepared to. And I don't think this is bank breaking either. It's likely to cost between 20 and 25 million, I would have thought, depending on the bonus structure of the deal. So there's a realistic chance that Newcastle are able to progress here. The player, I'm told, would be open to the move. It's just about whether or not they can persuade Milan to sell, because you're not looking at a transfer listed player. You're not looking at a quoted number. There's just a feeling in the industry that maybe 20 million, more likely 25 million, again, depending on bonus structure and all of these other important things, might be good enough. And right now, I would say of all of the names linked with Newcastle in that position, he is probably the most concrete target. And I would watch this space because I would expect Newcastle to be making a formal offer sooner rather than later.
Okay, Ben's looking fresh with his haircut, says Spenny. Lots of questions. Let's get through the next one. Keith says, Ben, how many more does he think has to leave Newcastle before one comes in? Do you think there'll be more outs before ins?
No, I don't think so. Just because we're at the situation now where it's that time of the year where you don't need to wait financially in order to bring in. You'll be thinking about squad size, of course. And we know that Newcastle would be willing to let Jamal Lewis, Ryan Fraser go. They still maybe need to look at their goalkeeper situation. And as we've said before, there's players like Trippier, Wilson, Almiron, Kraft. So you could kind of add all that up and say 3-4 could go out the door. But as long as they're happy enough with their squad size, regardless of who stays or goes, I don't think the finances will stop them moving in the market. Because now, if you need to balance the books, then you're talking about second half of this window, January, and up until the 30th of June 2025. So it's not a case of sell to buy financially, but it might be in terms of how Eddie Howe looks at his squad dynamic to make sure that the overall squad size doesn't balloon.
Okay. Next question is from Gary McRae. He says, what's happening with Almiron?
Yeah, no movement at the moment on Miguel Almiron, other than the fact we know at the right number Newcastle would be prepared to sell. We heard some reports a few weeks ago about Saudi Arabian clubs looking, and some even reported that Steven Gerrard's Al Ittifaq were directly in talks. That's not true to my understanding. Al Ittifaq are not in for Miguel Almiron. They've got Damari Gray. If he goes, perhaps a different story, but there's nothing that they've advanced at all. They've not even made an approach. But there are Saudi clubs that have looked at Almiron, but it comes back to what we said in January. Until he gives a green light, he's prepared to go to Saudi Arabia. There's no ability for them to progress things. It's not a problem negotiating with Newcastle. As I reported in January, there was a verbal agreement of around 30 million euros for Al Shabab and Almiron, but it didn't progress because they did the club-to-club negotiation. They then went to Almiron relatively in the dark as to whether or not he did or didn't want to go. And Almiron didn't want to go to Saudi and didn't want to move mid-season. So that's not going to change unless Almiron's perspective is different now to what it was in January. There are options for him to return to MLS. But again, I don't think that's right for the player. He still wants to stay in Europe, from what I'm told. So it's all pretty quiet on the Almiron front at the moment. But to reiterate what I said before, the number hasn't really changed from Newcastle's perspective. It would likely be a minimum of 20 million, perhaps even still as high as 25 million, which is about that 30 million euros that I mentioned. But so far, Almiron's planning for the new season with Newcastle United, but he is aware that if the right offer comes, Newcastle may say that we would like you to leave the club. They're not going to force him out, but if the right opportunity presents itself that suits all parties, then Newcastle will sell.
Mark Byers, good evening. He says, Hayden, Fraser, Lewis, chances of them leaving looking likely? Need them off the books.
Okay, let's start.
Yeah, I think that's probably true in what you say, that there's one or two that need to come off the books. And as I alluded to before, I think that both Jamal Lewis and Ryan Fraser are two that Newcastle will want to offload. And from Fraser's point of view, we know that there's a kind of a deal in principle agreed with Southampton already. So it's just a case of whether that one can be finalised or not. But I think that Newcastle are relatively optimistic that Fraser will go to Southampton, and the player's keen on that move. Jamal Lewis, I'm not aware of too many offers at this stage. And I think he was involved, wasn't he, in that pre-season game that they've already played. Almiron, we've already mentioned. Trippier, we've already mentioned. Dubravka, there is some interest. Celtic have now signed Kasper Schmeichel, but they were one of the clubs that had made an inquiry. There's nothing anymore in the Leicester links with Dubravka. Be interesting to see whether they can hold on to Mads Hermansen, especially now with Chelsea looking for a goalkeeper. Chelsea could explore that avenue along with James Trafford. Newcastle obviously looked at him as well, but they didn't agree a 20 million odd deal with Burnley. And then Philip Jorgensen for Chelsea as well. So we might see some goalkeeper movement now because there's a few that are on the move. For example, West Ham might be looking for another goalkeeper. I think there's some Saudi interest in Alphonse Areola. So Dubravka might be there, but I sense with a lot of the Premier League clubs, those that are looking for a keeper are more in the market for a number one. And I think Dubravka, if he stays in the Premier League, might struggle to move as an out-and-out number one. And therefore, if he does want to stay in England and the Premier League, might have to go and be a number two somewhere and compete for that. But it's easier, of course, if you go to like a Chelsea, for example, and only use Chelsea because they're the ones in the Club World Cup. They got Europa Conference League qualifier to have that playoff to get in the league. They've then got all the Europa League, domestic competitions that they went far in, Club World Cup and Premier League. So if you're a number two goalkeeper, you might go somewhere like that and say, I still could end up playing 20, 25 games. Whereas conversely, if you're a number two moving to a club like Newcastle without any European football, it might be the case that you don't feel it's worth your while, which is obviously why someone like Ramsdale, when he was linked, it was never concrete because at that point, and perhaps even still now, it was very much a fit Nick Pope as the number one. So a player like Ramsdale without any guarantees is not going to be interested in a club like Newcastle. But yeah, Fraser, Southampton, Lewis, Almiron, Kraft, Trippier, Hayden, even all could be available. So I think Newcastle will want at least 3 or 4 of them out of the door between now and when the window ends.
Okay, this one from JC. Heard yesterday from the Athletic that we paid 20 million for the goalkeeper after Forest paid a quarter of that and paid him 5 times before dropping him. Can Ben confirm that fee is accurate?
Yeah, I'm not so sure that fee is accurate. I asked a few people on this and the number doing the rounds is 22 million. I'm told that it's more around the 10 million mark. So that could be a bit exaggerated. Of course, you can have add-ons. Sometimes you get buyer and seller doing different things. But from Newcastle's point of view, the maths, even though a lot of people disputed it at the time, remember we said it on the show repeatedly, was in that window they would need of sales, of profit on the books to balance the books was that 30 to 50 million number. And of course, they sold a couple of players for something in the region of 35 and 30 or 35. That was Anderson to Forest and Minter. And then they got the Dan Ashworth compensation. So if you're looking at the club bringing in 65 to, let's just call it 80 million as a ballpark, depending on what fees you believe, then minus whatever they paid, it probably is getting you to something in the region of 50 to 70 million on their books of profit that allowed them to feel that they were compliant with PSR. Whereas if they're paying 22 million for a goalkeeper that is not even necessarily, if not likely, going to start the season as the number one, presuming that Nick Pope's fit, then that's a lot of money. So I'm not aware that that fee was 22 million. I'm told that it was closer to 10 million. And it kind of tallies with the maths from sources about what Newcastle spent, what they brought in and what they needed to satisfy PSR.
Okay, Spenny, good evening. He said, question for Ben. Any news about Mario Dewberry from Arsenal? Ben, he shoots our Eddie's profile and Mitchell's profile. Yeah,
nothing to add there at this stage. I don't think that there's anything advanced. I've seen the links with Newcastle player could be available, but nothing to add on that one at this point.
Barry says, Ben, you're more reliable than any other journal on Newcastle. Do you think there'll be some big names coming who haven't been linked yet? Newcastle, of course, do have that tendency to say, look over there whilst they win their business. Bruno, prime example, I guess. Botman was chased quite openly, but, ISAK came out of nowhere as well. So Newcastle do have a tendency to do their business in private.
Yeah, exactly. And thanks for the kind words, Barry. I think our job is to make it as least private as possible, but well-run clubs obviously try and keep things as secret as possible. I think the targets in defence are pretty well known at the moment. I think the striker ones are a little bit more up for debate. I know Newcastle like John Duran, for example, at Villa, but they were just not prepared to meet the valuation, and I don't expect them to return there. The long-standing links with your Tonys and your Solankes, I'm not so sure on. People always mention Solanke because the fact that Eddie Howe signed him at Bournemouth, but the reality is there's 65 million release clause there, and Newcastle would have no plans to pay that. And now Bill Foley's in charge at Bournemouth. He's not looking at them as a selling club. So he's very intent to keep his players, and that includes Solanke and also Milos Kirkos as well, who has some interest from Chelsea and Manchester United. So it wouldn't surprise me if Newcastle look again abroad for a striker, despite one or two links with players a little bit closer to home. Dominic Calvert-Lewin is still a name that Newcastle would buy if they could agree terms with the player, but they were not able to do that in and around the build-up to the PSR deadline, when at that point it was about Everton and Minter and Calvert-Lewin going the other way. But the interest in Calvert-Lewin hasn't gone away. So sometimes during the window, if you don't get your target, you return to the same target a little bit later, and then you just pay what it takes, maybe because you've got more need and urgency. So just because things go quiet, it doesn't mean that Newcastle won't return. But at this stage, I'm told that they're not in any active talks to reignite that Calvert-Lewin deal. So all of those signs do suggest that many of their targets, or linked ones, however much substance there is, have got this proven Premier League quality. But I do suspect under this new team with Mitchell and also James Bunce, who's very highly rated as well in the industry and will be working underneath Mitchell. And he's a very good hire from what I'm told, highly respected in the industry. So that combination is very excited. And the one thing that they've got in common is European experience. So let's watch this space, because that type of recruitment team, unlike Ashworth, who had come from Brighton, may be looking in slightly different areas. I'm not in any way saying Ashworth doesn't know Europe, because you don't have a recruitment expert that isn't deep globally everywhere, but you've still got your specialities. And naturally with Mitchell and with Bunce, they both have a little bit more experience working directly abroad, and that might change the kind of target that Newcastle are looking for.
Okay, Neil Calvert says, now the team's home, do you think we'll see some more concrete offers going in rather than media guesswork? And he also asks about Nico Gonzalez. He says he's been linked today. Anything in that?
Yeah, I think that the period of the window that we're at is very much slowed down by the fact that we've had the Euros and the Copa America, and a lot of players are now coming back from that and they're on a break. And it means that you have a situation where the market hits a lull, and then teams go off pre-season and managers actually look at what they've got. And that's when you get a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the first game of the season. And if you need to urgently add anyone, it picks up again. Then you get another lull because the season starts, and then you get the last kind of 10 days of the window. So it's not so much that Newcastle are quiet at this stage. It's just the fact that it's a natural lull within the market. And that's kind of quite important to note. With Nico Gonzalez, again, I'm not aware of anything advanced on the Newcastle front. I know they looked at him a little bit in January, and the feeling at the time was just that perhaps it would be a difficult deal. So now we just have to wait and see whether anything there progresses or not. And the thing as well about that particular player, I presume, by the way, we're talking about the Porto player, but correct me if I'm wrong, because there's a few Nico Gonzalez's and I'm on different time zones. So if you've got a new link with a different Nico, then let me know. But I'm talking about the midfielder that plays for Porto. He's only been there a year. As I say, Newcastle had looked at this one when he had a very successful spell with Valencia and wondered whether there was a deal there to be had, but didn't really like the terms. And he ended up moving instead to Porto, had a pretty solid season. They're in no desire or mood to sell. And if he does too well and there becomes an eventuality where he does want to go somewhere, there's a buyback there, to my knowledge, at Barcelona as well for under 10 million euros.
Okay, lots of questions about Eddie Howe. I'll pile them all into one corner and address them like this. Sully says, what's Ben's take on Eddie Howe's interview? John says, can we ask Ben, when are TalkSport and all the media going to stop trying to unsettle Howe and Newcastle's pre-season? The same people that said he wasn't elite and a failure last season. Alan also says, question, Ben, what are the thoughts on Eddie Howe becoming England manager? In my opinion, it's a death sentence to Eddie Howe's career. Simple as the Euros showed, England are winning nothing in our lifetime. So lots of people wanting your views on Eddie Howe's interview. Newcastle, of course, at the Adidas HQ in Germany last week. Lots of interviews given. Paul Mitchell, of course. We had Darren Eales and we had Eddie Howe. Also had input from a few of the players. But yeah, Eddie Howe in particular, what's your thoughts on that? And should he take the England job?
Yeah, good questions. And, always appreciate the feedback. I'm not going to talk about other journalists or outlets or anything like that. But from my point of view, I think a lot of Newcastle fans, many fans, I get it from Manchester United, I get it from Chelsea. They sometimes think the media are unsettling their club or have an agenda. And by the way, I respect that because you watch more of your club than I do. You've therefore got a different perspective. And I'm not here to tell fans what they should or shouldn't think regarding agendas or biases. I'm just here to give my opinion. And that's why ultimately I come on shows like this, because you get the opportunity to give feedback and ask questions, whether positive or negative. And we have a debate about it. So it's not for me to say this outlet or this person does this because of that. It's just for me to come on these kind of shows and engage in the most honest way I can and present the information as best as I can. And then if you still think that I, rather than outlets or others, have got an agenda, absolutely, I respect that. And if you don't, then that is the logic of coming on here. With some of the things where you think, and again, I'm not just talking about Newcastle, there's an agenda against your club. Sometimes you have to not just look at the now and then think it's a storm to unsettle the club. You have to look at hindsight. So I said right at the beginning of the takeover that I thought there was an exit plan for Amanda Staveley, and I got hammered for it at the time. And now she's gone within 3 years as part of a pre-planned thing. I said piracy was a big issue and I got hammered. And I still maintain it was a big issue. Other people will say other things. I said Newcastle needed minimum 30 million, if not 50 million for PSR. And I got hammered because I was told that it was an agenda against the club and they were fine financially. And now I think it's common knowledge that they scrambled. I said Man City were interested in Bruno Guimaraes and still are. It's now widely reported. I'm not saying he's going to go. But again, I got told, why are you saying that when the player wants to stay? But let's see what happens. So the release clause is gone. It wasn't triggered. I don't think anyone ever said it was going to be triggered. So sometimes you have to look back. And the reason why I say that is because now people will think, why all this England Howe agenda when he wants to stay at Newcastle? But let's wait and see who the England manager is. I'm not saying for any 1 minute it's definitively going to be Eddie Howe. But I would still say there's a realistic chance that Eddie Howe is on the final shortlist of 3 or 4, and that regardless of whether he wants to stay or go, he takes that interview, because the England jobs don't come around that often. And I think you can, without contradiction, take an interview and still want to stay at Newcastle. But I think you have to almost, if your country comes calling, take the interview and then see what the impact of that interview is on you. But right now, where I think we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves on the Howe front is that there's just a list of names. There's no leading candidate to my knowledge. There's no guarantee that Howe is going to be the one that gets offered the job. There's nothing to suggest it will definitively be Eddie Howe. There could be Potter, there could be Pochettino, there could be others. So the only real difference between Howe's interview and, say, Postecoglou is Postecoglou, when linked, pretty much laughed it off as if to say, why am I even being asked about that? I was having a nap. I saw the stories. There's nothing in it. So his implication is that he's pretty much distancing himself. Whereas with Eddie Howe, he said his commitment to Newcastle is unwavering, but the balance at the club, the dynamic has to be right. And I would encourage everyone to listen to the full interview, because I don't think Howe for any 1 minute fueled anything. I don't think Howe for any second implied that his head might be turned. And I don't think Howe in any way implied he was thinking about anything other than Newcastle. So all of that's good news. And if you want to just hear the unwavering, which is probably the lead bullet point, then you can sleep easy at night. And I do think that is the headline from all of it, that Eddie Howe has an unwavering commitment. But then he dug a little bit deeper, didn't he? And he sort of said, it's about the club dynamic, it's about the project, it's about the direction of travel, and therefore the door could be open. And, who knows how long it's going to take England to do this process, and who knows when Newcastle are going to be halfway through the season. And that might change and define things as well. So this is where the doors open, because the England process is so early, and Eddie Howe therefore can't think about it because no one's approached him yet, and he's got a season to prepare with for Newcastle. So I think it's a non-story now, other than who the names might be. And then in a month's time or 2 months' time, as they get more towards the concrete stage of the interview, we wait and see whether Eddie Howe is either more tempted or alternatively the FA push a little bit harder to get him to interview. So for now, I'll just say, let's wait. And then let's take Howe at his word, which is he's focused on Newcastle. And it's important to respect that and not disrupt that, because otherwise it can create a bit of a storm, and it might be a storm over nothing. But just give it, as I say, because hindsight's a wonderful thing, a couple more months, and then let's see what the true lay of the land is, because I still maintain that Howe is both committed to Newcastle, but if he was given an interview for England, even if he stayed at Newcastle, he would take that interview so the full picture and both options are in front of him, and it might benefit Newcastle. So a lot of people are sort of here saying, why England, why Howe, why disrupt? But actually, if you're clever and you're Eddie Howe and your commitment is unwavering to Newcastle United, then you engage with England, because that's sort of the, for want of a better word, patriotic thing to do. And then you go back to Newcastle and you use that as leverage to get everything that you need. So Howe can be in a win-win position here, because he can either stay at Newcastle or he can interview for England and use that to get what he needs out of Newcastle, which is why I think he spoke in that interview about the dynamic. And that's sort of almost sending more of a message to Newcastle to say, look, I'm in demand because I'm doing well. And that might be used as leverage to get Howe what he needs at Newcastle as well. So there's not just two scenarios here, there's three. He just stays. He stays and leverages England, or of course he goes. And that's what I think might make it interesting if it develops. But we're way too early to be talking about Howe being even a leading candidate. He's just a candidate that, when the final shortlist comes, might realistically get an interview along with potentially 4 or 5 others. And from there, we'll know how much substance there is to this.
Okay, Tom Dixon, Jason Reacher and Stoley all want to know, is there anything good doing in the Jonathan David situation, another player linked with Newcastle?
Yeah, I'd hope so, because this was a story that I broke and is now widely picked up. So you would always hope that the stories that you link have substance to them. But Newcastle have just inquired about Jonathan David, and nothing more than that at this stage. And part of that was because, like other players, he wanted to focus on the Copa America. So I think between now and, let's just call it, first week in August, we'll get much more clarity on the David situation, because I'm told that he wants a new club before the European season start. He's going to be available for 25 million, in that ballpark, which is a bit of a steal, because even 6 months ago, the fee being quoted by Lille was 35 to 40 million. And a year ago, it was 55 million. So it's dropped significantly because he's only got 1 year left on his contract. And this might be something that Newcastle move for, because again, as I said before, Mitchell knows the French market really well. David scored a heck of a lot of goals, not just last season, but the season before. I think it was 30 odd in all competitions in back-to-back seasons. And when you have that kind of player and available at only 25 million, it's hard to overlook. So Newcastle have inquired. Chelsea have opened exploratory talks. West Ham might be there if they move away from John Duran, and several Premier League clubs therefore, which might mean that England is the more likely destination at this stage. Milan had looked, but they've just signed Alvaro Morata. So I'd be surprised whether they enter the race now for David. And the player would like to move to the Premier League. So David to Newcastle could be one to watch. But at this stage, we're not talking offers or terms discussed. We're just talking about an initial inquiry to understand the terms of the deal. And now he's back from the Copa America, things should progress.
Solly says, thanks for answering that, Ben. He says, good luck with the exclusive. Michael says, who is our strongest link at the minute? Which player would you say is the strongest and has most chance of arriving at SJP?
Yeah, I think, like I said before, Malik Thiaw is probably the one, because Newcastle have been working on that for quite some time. So I don't think we're talking at interest or admiration, which I know many fans hate. I think we're talking at formal offer sooner rather than later. So that for me is the most concrete link at the moment. And then many of the other names either are not as priority positions, or alternatively, they're still understanding what the player desires and what the fee is, because the window's hit a bit of a lull. I think Chalobah and Newcastle might pick up as well. I certainly wouldn't say that it's anything to get excited about at this point. It could be Manchester United as well. And the player's always said if he's to leave Chelsea that he wants European football. But, you know, when you join a club like Newcastle, you have a confidence that that's what they can get. That's what they're building towards. So sometimes when a player says they want European football, it's not so much it has to be now. It's more just it has to be a project that can get it. And Newcastle have obviously proven that they can do that. And was it not for the FA Cup final, from a league position, they finished in a European spot. And we shouldn't forget that. So when you're pitching to players, okay, you haven't got European football, but not every player is that rigid. They just don't want to join, perhaps, like my club, Leicester, where they feel that European football might never come in their tenure. And I mean no disrespect to my own club. And obviously we did win the Premier League and have many years of European football. But right now, if you join Leicester on a 3-year deal, it's unlikely you're going to get European football in those 3 years. If you join Newcastle on a 3-year deal, there's a fair chance that European football will come at that point. So they might be able to use that to their advantage if they're negotiating for a player like Chalobah. But I'm seeing a pattern in sources at the moment where most of the more concrete targets are centre-backs. And some of those centre-backs are centre-backs that are versatile and can play at fullback as well. And that suggests to me that the most urgent and pressing priority for Newcastle is to find a centre-back. Then you would imagine they would move on to a right-sided player. And we know as far as wide players are concerned and versatile players are concerned, they already tried for Elise. They were in that conversation. So they are working on things concurrently. But the more concrete names I'm hearing are defenders at this stage.
Okay, what's happened to ISAK's new deal? It seems to have gone quiet.
I don't think quiet. It's just more that it's the window. If you're not prepared to sell the player, you're not in any rush. There's no need to do it now. If you feel like the player will stay and or you're not prepared to sell, then ultimately you don't have to get it done now. You can get it done when the window shuts. So people are busy, and you also always want to leave the door open. And again, I'm not for any minute saying that here's Newcastle desperately trying to sell any of their star names. But due to circumstance, when we had that PSR deadline, some clubs tried their luck with ISAK. We know that Chelsea made an inquiry. There was nothing in the Nicholas Jackson swap deal, and there was nothing really in Newcastle wanting to sell. But people try their luck. And if you ever get in a situation where you had to sell, we know that Anthony Gordon was that possibility as well. So the last thing that you want to do is take players off the table just in case needs must. And I think of every single player at Newcastle United, ISAK is the last on the list that Newcastle would be prepared to sell. But you just never know. It could have been a scenario where somebody came on deadline day, they didn't sell Anderson and Minter, and someone said, here's 150 million for ISAK. And you're like, okay, now we've just got to accept it. So you put everything on hold because you just focused on other things. And then now the expectation is obviously that ISAK is untouchable. PSR deadline's passed, and they will likely try and get him to sign a new deal. The other thing I'm told with ISAK is that, and here's the danger, we discussed this on a few other shows, when you cede to Bruno, albeit at a very high number, so it was quite good from Newcastle, a release clause, it becomes more likely that ISAK will ask for the same. And Newcastle don't really like doing release clauses traditionally, but they did it for Bruno, and it was a mutual decision, and it was high enough that, as we've seen, nobody bit. But then when you're negotiating with Alexander Isak, he may want specifics if he's to extend, whereby perhaps he can leave if a Champions League club comes calling, or perhaps he wants a release clause around the 100 to 115 million mark. And that might slow things down a bit as well. And you haven't got time to have this back and forth during the window, especially not when players are on their off season. You wouldn't expect to be negotiating with a player in the month of June or early July because they're on their holidays, they're away, some of them are at international tournaments, and therefore it's just not the right time. And then add to that 2 key board members going, a new sporting director coming in. It's just not the right time to be sitting down with the player and trying to finalize this kind of thing. But that doesn't mean there's any panic. It would be absolutely staggering now if the window shuts and Isak isn't a Newcastle player.
Yeah, it will be. PDK, thank you for your question. He said, could Breel and Bono be a target for Mitchell? Obviously, he's switched forward.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen these links a little bit, but he's 27. And I think that at this stage will put Newcastle off. I suspect they'll want to buy a bit younger. The links are no doubt with Mitchell and Monaco, and he's been there a couple of years now. Didn't actually play too often in 23-24 from what I gather, whereas the previous season he had an incredible season and scored double figures in the league. But I'm not so sure on this one because the player is on the return back from an ACL injury. I think he's fit now, but he didn't play that many games as a result. So probably not one that makes a lot of sense at this stage. I would imagine that his future will just be on getting regular game time, having, to my knowledge anyway, only played a handful of games last season.
Daniel, he says, heard anything about Dean Hutchinson? Is he? He's a defender, isn't he? Is he the Juventus defender?
Yeah, I think Villa were the club that I always heard on this one, rather than necessarily Newcastle, and Bournemouth could be another one to watch. I'm not so sure about Newcastle. I haven't massively heard links at this stage, but you're absolutely right in what you say. Juventus defender has been looked at by a few top clubs, certainly scouted by Liverpool, PSG, Villa, and Bournemouth, to my knowledge. Not so sure, like I say, about Newcastle in terms of seriously entering the race at this stage. There is some interest as well from a couple of German clubs. I think Stuttgart are probably the main one to watch. And I think it's probably a 20-25 million outlay, but not too much to add on the Newcastle front on that one.
Okay, question there from Mark Wright. He says, so with all the rumours, what do you think Ashworth's fee was? Was there any kind of announcement on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different sources and sides on this, as you would expect, because from Newcastle's point of view, they want to make out like they've got a great deal, and it's not necessarily PSR related. Whereas from Manchester United's perspective, I think sources are very clear that this was a deal done at urgency with a view to Newcastle's PSR. So the thing I can say definitively, because there's some alignment from sources on both sides, and definitively, as per my information, I respect if others have put out different numbers, but it's not higher than 10 million. And I'm told it's closer to the region of 7 million. And that's the sort of ballpark that we're in, which is still pretty good business as far as Newcastle are concerned. And they needed that money as far as PSR and balancing the books are concerned. So I think if they were in a slightly healthier financial position, then that deal would not necessarily have got done at the time that it did.
There's the one from JC. He says there's a Dutch lad at Strasbourg called Emmanuel Omega. Massive, strong, quick. Has Ben heard any clubs have an interest in him? Would love to see him come to our third option.
Yeah, as you say, this is a player that is very highly rated at Strasbourg at the moment, but he's only been there for one season and he was excellent last season. So the Strasbourg position is that they don't want to sell. And this is the sort of Blue Co model because they're now Chelsea's parent company. So they feel in another year, the value is going to raise even higher. And then they'll have the opportunity to see if there's a pathway within the group. At the moment, I'm not hearing that there's any links with Chelsea specifically, or whether or not they would be able to sell and ultimately turn in a big profit. But the Strasbourg model is very much to keep these young players at this stage. And the vast majority, if not almost all of the Strasbourg squad is going to be under the age of 23. So you've got a player that only joined from Sturm Graz in 2023. He did ever so well last campaign. He's still very young. He's 6'5", 6'6", physical, strong, quick, prolific in front of goal. I'd be relatively surprised if Bluco and Strasbourg sanctioned a sale this summer.
Andy says, question for Ben, how serious is Liverpool's interest in Kubo? I'd be gutted. He's my number one choice for our right wing.
Yeah, good player, isn't he? And I think that Liverpool are one of the clubs that have looked at him, but nothing, again, advanced at this point. I think we know that Liverpool are really keen at the moment to move quite quickly in the window. And Kubo is a player they looked at. But we're hearing a lot of reports, particularly out of Japan, that sort of say Liverpool will pay the 60 million release clause or that the deal is really advanced. And again, none of that is my understanding. I don't think Liverpool have got any intent to pay the 60 million release clause. I don't think that anything is about to be signed. I think Liverpool have just appreciated the player, but not the price tag. And I think that's what puts Newcastle out the mix as well, that Sociedad are of the belief at the moment that it's release clause or nothing. And even if you go below the release clause, that's still a 50 million euros deal. And that's putting off Liverpool. And it's also probably putting off Newcastle. Not that I'm even aware that they've sort of made any meaningful inquiry there. But I mentioned Newcastle just because you mentioned Newcastle in the question. So maybe you've seen more links than I have. But he's there with Sociedad on their pre-season tour. And that's usually an indication that a deal's not close with Liverpool or with any other club.
Should anything be read into this? Les, thoughts on City triggering buyback clause for Trafford?
Not at this stage. I mean, Trafford's an interesting one. Could be one to watch for Chelsea. I think Newcastle have backed off for now. People might say, how have they not completed a deal? Because it was a 16 million offer and Burnley wanted 20, but the 16 million offer was very weighted in add-ons. And therefore, it wasn't just about upping it by 4 million for Newcastle. It was about also changing the structure of the deal. I don't think Trafford would go back now to City because he wants to be a number one goalkeeper wherever he moves. And what we know with City is even if Ederson go, Stefan Ortega might be the number one, or alternatively, they could buy another goalkeeper. And I don't think Trafford's quite ready for that move. So Trafford to City, the buyback option or a move back there still has to have player buy-in. And I'm not sure that's what James Trafford is looking for.
Okay, last couple of questions. Xavi Simons, Ben, where do you think he'll go, says Tom?
Yeah, I say what I've said 6 months ago. I broke an exclusive on this where I said that it will only be a loan and there's a very realistic chance he'll go back to Leipzig. And now after Bayern and Chelsea and Lord knows who else linked with the player, and some of those links are genuine, we're back where we started, that there's a very realistic chance that Xavi Simons will go back to Leipzig. Bayern are still there as well. The Premier League clubs don't like the fact that it's likely to only be a loan, and the lack of permanence means that from the perspective of Premier League suitors, they want to buy now, and that's not something that PSG will sanction. And the reason for that is because if PSG sell now, then the club that benefits is Simons' former club, PSV. If they sell after January 2025, then there's no benefit anymore to PSV, which means PSG have got the option to either bring him back or alternatively sell him and benefit. And under both scenarios, there's less benefit to PSV. There's no benefit regarding a sale after January 2025 to PSV. And if they play him for PSG, there's bonuses activated, but it's still less expensive than if he plays for PSG now. And this is why there's been a serious discussion at PSG as to how best to deal with it so they can develop the player, keep the player, have the option to bring him back and not owe money to PSV. And that's why we're dealing with a loan and the Premier League clubs are not as interested. So it's looking like straight race between Leipzig and Bayern. And I stand by what I ran 6 months ago. Nothing's really moved. There was always a very realistic chance that he'd return to Leipzig. And there's still a very realistic chance that he'll return on loan to Leipzig.
Okay, great stuff. Anyone who asked a question that was non-transfer related about a certain player, I decided to give it a miss tonight. No offense to you guys. I just wanted to try and get as many yeses and nos on different players that people asked about. We'll get Ben hopefully back on again next week because things are starting to hot up and Ben is kindly come on with him being abroad. And great to see you, Ben. When are you back?
Got 2.5 weeks here. I won't be doing Newcastle this time. Last year, of course, Newcastle were in America at that Premier League Summer Series. So it was great to catch up with various Newcastle people, including some of the fans that are listening in this show. But I've got 2.5 weeks. I'll do Chelsea, Man City, Liverpool, Arsenal, Real Madrid, Wrexham and Celtic during my time here. 5 different pit stops, of which the first one is Chelsea against Wrexham, which kicks off tomorrow evening.
Great stuff. I'll let you crack on. Hopefully sort one out for next week, mate. Take care and safe travels.
Look forward to it. All the best, everyone. Speak soon.
A big thanks to all our sponsors. Skips and Bins. You can find their website at skipsandbins.com. Contact us, www.skipsandbins.com/contact. Say hello to low-cost waste disposal with pay-as-you-go and contract waste management. A big thanks to Mr. Vicky's Sauces, handmade in Cumbria. Their website, mrvickies.co.uk. Email info@mrvickies.co.uk. Telephone 01768 210 102. Thanks to United Group Travel. They are the Travel and Tourism Award winners in 2024. Their website, www.unitedgrouptravel.com. Email beverly.ugtl@gmail.com or telephone 01670 632 460 or mobile 0791 666 4174. Just £30 per person deposit. There are no strangers on our tours, just friends you haven't met yet. A big thanks to Media Arts. You can find them at www.media-arts.co.uk. And don't forget, we are a podcast. You can find us on iTunes or Spotify or other podcast providers. If you want to help the channel grow, then hit the like button, the little thumb underneath the video, click share and share to your social media, or join the channel for as little as $1.99 a month. If you want to take out a one-off payment membership, go to nufcmatters.com and hit membership. And for a £25 fee, you get a scarf, a cup, a pen, and a membership card. You can also put a smartphone over the top of this QR code. It'll take you straight there. And don't forget, we also help the food bank on this channel. nufcfansfoodbank.co.uk is a website where you can make a virtual donation today.